Welcome to Crosswaves. We're glad that you're with us, and we are in our series on what would Jesus do. And this week we are looking at when Jesus fed the 4,000 men. Now, this is a fascinating study. Many of you who are listening to this might know that Jesus at one point fed 5,000 men and their families. And this is basically a recurrence of that where he feeds 4,000 men and their families. Now, there are people out there that will say this is the same miracle, that feeding of the 5,000, they just got different numbers. And you just go, well, that makes no sense, because the feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle that Jesus performed that's mentioned in all four Gospels. This miracle is mentioned in Mark, and it's also mentioned in Matthew. And why would these two guys who's writing this letter mention the same thing twice? It makes no sense, and we're going to see why everything is different. Outside of them counting men, and their families are not, the women and children aren't counted. Outside of that, there's nothing else basically the same. And so we'll get into that, of why this is such an important miracle. And I'm just going to give you a hint. If you're not Jewish, you are called a Gentile. And so for me, this miracle is more impressive for me than the other one. And that's because this miracle was done for Gentiles. And so hopefully, if you didn't know that, we'll figure that out as we go through. And so Jesus is returning to the Sea of Galilee, its northeast coast. This is still Gentile territory, pagan land. And so we are going to be in Matthew chapter 15, verses 29 through 39. And we always start with, what does the Bible say? We believe the Bible is the most interesting book that you will ever read. And yet as Christians, we take it a step further, because we believe that this book was inspired by God, and it's our textbook. It's what we use on how to know what we are to do in our lives, and how to God is revealing himself through the scriptures. All right, I wanted to give you an idea here of, we've got picture 1 and picture 2. I've labeled these. Last week, Jesus left Capernaum, that spot right there on the top of the Sea of Galilee, near the bottom of the frame there on picture number 1, and he went up to Phoenicia, between Tyre and Sidon. And we don't know exactly, it just says he went into that region, and we don't know exactly where he landed in that area, but that is north of Galilee. This is definitely pagan land. And Mark tells us that he went into a house, and he didn't want anybody to know he was there. So it looks like every time he tried to get away to get rest, people would find him. So it looks like he went into Gentileville, pagan land, went away from Galilee, and tried to get into an area where it's all Gentiles and people wouldn't know him. Now, last week we looked at a woman came to him who had a son that was demon-possessed. And so even though he was in this area where there weren't Jewish people, like in Galilee, he was still found. Now, we don't know how long he was there. And the Scripture doesn't give us a hint, doesn't tell us. And then the Bible tells us that he came down into what is called Decapolis. Deca meaning 10, Polis cities, 10 cities. And I put a square there on that, so you see an idea of where he went down. So I've moved that map up a little bit. So he comes south, and he's now on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, and that area is still all Gentiles. If you went to the left side of the Jordan River, you would be in Galilee. You go to the right side of the Jordan River, that's going right down the middle of that second picture there, you're in pagan land. At one point, this was Manasseh, when the 12 tribes came in. That's what the area where Manasseh wanted to live. Okay, and now it is very Gentiles because of the Greeks who had come in and taken it over. And so the Jews lived on the other side of the Jordan. The Gentiles basically lived on this side. And also that is where, when you look at that, also at the bottom of the Sea of Galilee, that's where Jesus went into that area, and he healed, he cast out the demons out of the man, and they went into the pigs, and the man's name was Legion. And so again, that would have been in that same area where he's at now. All right? So, let's start reading in verse 29, and it says, Jesus returned to the Sea of Galilee and climbed a hill and just sat down. A vast crowd brought to him people who were lame, blind, crippled, those who couldn't speak, and then it goes on to say, and many others. So there is just about every kind of sickness or illness in this group. They laid them before Jesus, and he healed them all. Not some of them, he healed them all. The crowd was amazed. Those who hadn't been able to speak were talking. The crippled were made well, and the lame were walking, and the blind could see again. Now, these people, we go back to the map, these people, these Gentiles, I want you to understand the situation. If you're in the west side of the Jordan River, on the other side of the Jordan River, they're Jews, and they believe in one God. They're monotheistic. When you come to the other side where the Gentiles live, they wouldn't be raising pigs on the west side of the Jordan, but on the east side of the Jordan, they'd be raising pigs. And on the east side of the Jordan, they were polytheists, which means they believed in a bunch of gods. And so they believe in all kinds of gods, where the Jews only believed in one God. And so when we look at this passage of Scripture here, Jesus is healing all these people, and for them to believe in the God of Israel wasn't really a big deal. They just believed in a bunch of other gods with the God of Israel. They just accepted there's a bunch of gods. If you go into the book of Acts, when Paul went into Athens, they were, it tells us they were like statues of all the different gods, and they even had a statue for an unknown God, just in case they missed one of them. So these people believed in all kinds of gods. And so Matthew omits the details of entering into Decapolis and just generalizes about the miracles, whereas Mark tells us where he actually went and why he's there. And so that's why we know he's in Decapolis, because Mark is the one shedding light on that. And then he goes into one of Jesus' miracles and goes into greater detail, and he wants to help the Romans, who Mark is writing to. That's his audience. He wants the Romans to understand that Jesus cares for the Gentiles too. Jewish people, especially at this time, were very racist. They thought of themselves supreme. They thought they were better. And last week we looked at where they would call people who were not Jewish dogs. That was their slang term. You're a dog. And so they were very racist. And Jesus is using this opportunity to teach his disciples that they are not to be racist, because they're watching all this that has happened. So Jesus sits down on this hillside, and people are bringing all these different sick people to them. And like I said, it's clear these people aren't Jews. And why do we know they're not Jews? Let's finish that last verse in 31. It says, the lame were walking and the blind could see again. And then it says this, and they praised the God of Israel. Now, Jews wouldn't have said that, but these people, being Gentiles, are like, wow, this guy represents that God of Israel, and look at all the way he's healing people. So they're praising that God. They never doubted that the God of Israel existed, but now they've seen such a display that they're praising him as superior to all their other gods. Okay? So that's where they are right now. Verse 32 says, then Jesus called his disciples and told them, I feel sorry for these people. Now, when Jesus fed the 5,000 Jews, the 5,000 men who were Jews and their families, on top of that, they were with him just one day. Mark tells us that this is for 3 days he's been healing people. So if they brought food, they have basically have run out of food. And so it says here, I feel sorry for these people, not the disciples. They're still Jews that have a racist attitude. But Jesus says, I feel sorry for these people. They have been here with me for 3 days, and they have nothing left to eat. I don't want to send them away hungry, or they will faint along the way. Now, verse 33 is an amazing verse, because it says, the disciples replied, where would we get enough food here in the wilderness for such a huge crowd? Before, they were close to Bethsaida, even though that town wouldn't have been big enough to handle all the influx of food. Here, they're out kind of in the wilderness. There's 10 cities in that area, but none of them are right there. And they're like, where would we get the food? You're basically sitting there going, don't you guys remember some months earlier when you fed 5,000? Why wouldn't they say, Jesus, are you going to do that miracle again? You remember when you fed the 5,000? Are you going to do that again? The only reason we don't see them asking that question is that we come up with is that these are Gentiles. You used that last miracle to talk about the bread of life, and you were talking to Jews. Obviously, these are Gentiles. You're not going to do that kind of miracle and feed Gentiles, are you? And so, verse 34 said, Jesus asked, how much bread do we have? And they replied, 7 loaves and a few small fish. So what we see here is it's a different number. Remember, the other one was 5 loaves and 2 fish. Here's 7 loaves and a few small fish. And so this group is Gentile. The other group is, it was Jews. Now, another way we know that these are Gentiles is they use a different word for basket that we see in our text. And when you see the word basket in the Jewish version, the word they use is a small basket. And in this text, what we're seeing is a basket that would fit a man. And Paul at one point was put in a basket and laid over a wall so he could get out of the city. That's this kind of basket. So this is a much, much bigger basket, and it's the word that Greeks would use, Gentiles would use, where the other basket was a word that Jews would use. And so that's how we know. Now, just to show you the differences, In the Jewish version, they fed 5,000 men. In this version, they are feeding 4,000 men and their families. There was primarily Jews near Bethsaida. This is Gentiles near Decapolis. It was 5 loaves and 2 fish with the Jews. It's here we've got 7 loaves and a few fish. The crowd was with Jesus for 1 day with the Jews. Here they're with them for 3 days. And so it's clear that the numbers are different. And so Matthew and Mark were at or Mark is repeating, is getting his information from Peter. But you got Peter and Matthew that were at the first one. Why are they telling the same story twice unless it's a different story? This is a different story. Now we get to verse 35. It says, so Jesus told all the people to sit down on the ground. Now in the Jews, he had them sit down in 50s and 100s because that's the way they did it in the Old Testament. And he's wanting to teach them, you know, he's trying to bring this back to what Moses did with the manna and how God fed the people through Moses in the Old Testament. They would understand that reference, 50 and 100. Oh, that's what they did in the Old Testament. Here, he doesn't do that because these Gentiles don't know the Old Testament. So there's no need to split them up that way. Then he took 7 loaves and the fish, thanked God for them. Again, remember, every time Jesus eats in the Bible, he blesses his food and gives thanks for it. He broke them into pieces and he gave to the disciples who distributed the food to the crowd. They all ate as much as they wanted. They went home full. Afterwards, the disciples picked up 7 large baskets of leftover food. And again, these are huge baskets. There's more food left over here than there was with the Jews and the 5,000 men. There were 4,000 men who were fed that day in addition to all the women and children. Then Jesus sent the people home, and he got into a boat and crossed over to the region of Magdan, which would have been where the town of Magdala is. And so he feeds all these people. Again, and, you know, it's just an amazing miracle. And the whole point here is he's trying to show the disciples that we just don't help the Jews, we help everybody. So that brings us to question number 2. How has God provided for a need in your life or someone you know closely? So how has God provided a need in your life? Talk that in your hotspot and then come on back and we'll see how we can learn some things from this and obey it. All right? Welcome back. And so how can you obey? What do we just pick up out of this story? 1, Jesus' power to heal and care for others have no rival. Didn't matter whether you were Jewish or whether you were a Gentile. Jesus cared for everybody, and he loved everybody. And this was a big deal to these Jews. They were shocked that Jesus, it's one thing to heal the Gentiles, but Jews don't eat with Gentiles at this day. You just didn't do that. And so for Jesus to feed these Gentiles had to be a huge statement to these disciples in their learning, because they're like, seriously, you're going to feed these people? We don't eat with Gentiles. So Jesus' power to heal and care for others has no rival. And we got to always remember, though he doesn't really need us, we're talking about God, God chooses to do his work through us. And so the disciples were part of this. They had to pass out the food. They had to collect the food. God uses us. He does the miracle, but he wants to work through us. And so we can never take credit for what God does. We should be just thankful that he uses us. And then Jesus cares for the whole world. And that's the whole point of this being in this um, story. Um, Mark is writing to Romans, and he wants the Romans to know that Jesus cares for Gentiles. Matthew is writing to Jews, and he wants the Jews to know Jesus cares for the Gentiles. And so that's what he's wanting to know. And what's fascinating is Jesus said twice, said something great about somebody's faith. The Canaanite woman from last week and a centurion whose son was sick. The two people that Jesus praised the most for their faith were both Gentiles. Again, I find that fascinating that the Lord did that. So here's our third question. Have you ever experienced something so wonderful that you just had to tell everyone about it? What would it take to get you so excited about being a Christian that you would want to tell others? So what does this passage say about Jesus? Well, as in the feeding of the 5,000, this miracle took place in the Lord's hand. As Jesus broke the bread and he gave it to his disciples, the bread multiplied. As he took the fish again and broke it, and the fish multiplied. And so it's always important for us to remember that it is God who does things. You know, I've said this many times that when people will say, I'm a self-made man. Are you? I mean, God gave you the intellect to be able to think through what you're doing. God gave you the energy. I mean, we try to take credit all the time for things that we don't even think about giving God the credit for, and He should be the foremost one that we give credit to. And so always remember that all the miracles here took place in Jesus' hand. It's almost the same as we looked at when Jesus was teaching that he was the bread of life. They said, well, Moses fed them daily. And Jesus had to correct them and go, Moses did nothing. It was God who provided the manna. Moses happened to be leading the people, but it was God who provided the manna. And so many times we try to take credit or give credit to a human when we should be giving credit to God. And then what is your takeaway? Well, for me, the takeaway is that Jesus did not follow this with a sermon on the bread of life like he did with the feeding of the 5,000. We took 2 weeks looking at the bread of life sermon, and then we took another week looking at how the people just didn't understand what Jesus was saying in that sermon, and they left Jesus. And so we really spent 3 weeks talking about that sermon in one form or another. And yet Jesus here just gets in the boat and goes away and doesn't do another follow-up sermon about the bread of life. And the reason for that is these people would not have understood the bread of God because they weren't Jewish. They didn't know the Old Testament. And so that would have been, if he would have done that, it would have been foreign to these people. So the point for me, the takeaway is Jesus always adapted his teaching to the needs and understanding of the people to whom he ministered to. It's very important that you and I don't use Christianese words, words that a non-Christian wouldn't know, a non-church person wouldn't know. We need to break things down in their language and what they understand. We can't talk over people's heads. We can't use reference points in Scripture that a person doesn't know that story. And so when sharing your faith with others, you need to understand who are you talking to and what level of knowledge do they already possess, and then stay in that arena where they will understand you. Never overtalk or talk above people and they just look at you with glazed eyes and I didn't get any of that. All right? I hope you think about that this week, that Jesus fed the 5,000 men and their families were Jewish. Jesus feeding the 4,000 men and their families, that was Gentiles. God loves everybody. That's why John 3:16 doesn't say, for God so loved the Jews that he gave his one and only begotten Son. He says, God so loved the world. And I'm so thankful for that because I'm part of the world. I'm not part of the Jewish family. And so I'm glad that Jesus cares for all his creation. So think about that this week as you strive to become more like Christ as we study the Bible, serve others, and share our faith together. Then our last question, what are you doing to reach out to others of a different race to help them learn about Jesus?
Feel free to contact Crosswaves and tell us all about your experience. We would love to hear from you. Send us your prayer requests or questions about the Bible or Crosswaves Church. To keep up to date, visit our Facebook page and subscribe to the Crosswaves YouTube channel. We want to take a minute and say thank you to all you who donate online or send checks to Crosswaves Church through our app or website. Thank you for being a generous Christian and fueling the mission to reach more and more people for Christ.
You know what time it is? Do you know what time it is? Do you know what time it is? Joke of the week, where we only promise that 3 out of 10 jokes are actually funny. Here we go. Beauregard is walking his dogs when a man walking in the opposite direction says, "Oh my, you have such beautiful dogs. What are their names?" Beauregard replies, "Well, the taller one is Timex, and the shorter one is Rolex." Timex and Rolex. The man responds, that's interesting. Why did you name them such kind of weird names? Beauregard just sighs, and shakes his head, and he says, everyone keeps asking me that. They keep asking me the exact same thing. Why did you name the dogs that? And he just went, duh. What else would you name your watchdogs? Hey, if you've got a joke for us, send it to us at jokes@crosswaveschurch.com, and we hope you have a fun week.